Good morning, everyone. My name is Sanam with New England Prestige Realty.
And I am Kelly Turner with Total Mortgage. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about estate, probate, and everything in between.
It doesn't sound like it should have a lot to do with real estate, but it does all of the time.
It absolutely does. So we were actually sharing some war stories earlier about what's happened to our clients in between a real estate transaction when the unexpected happens.
Absolutely. And sometimes when you're purchasing an estate or probate property, ahead of time. Sometimes borrowers don't. And sometimes things do happen midway through a transaction that can change ownership of the property.
Yeah. Changes the whole, trajectory of timing, the whole timing of it all.
Yeah. So let's talk first. What is an estate property? What does that mean?
Yeah. So an estate property is basically real estate where the owners have now passed. And if there's a will, then it typically goes to an executor or an executrix. And if there's no will, then typically the heirs would have to go to probate, and they would be assigned the administrator to handle the estate.
Absolutely. And probate can happen with a will or without a will. It's essentially done with a will once people have it. So that you can sell a house that is currently in probate. It does not have to be complete, but it can make for some tricky times in a real estate transaction. Usually a borrower knows when they're making the offer. A lot of times it's them ahead of time who the seller is and that it's not a person.
Correct. It'll say it's an estate sale. And in fact, with estate sales, there are no required disclosures because technically the person selling it wasn't the owner, right? They inherited it, or they inherited the rights or responsibilities for it. So
so they're not required to say, how old is this roof? Have you ever had water damage? Because the person who would be filling it out may have never lived in the house or may have only lived in the house as children. So it can be a little bit tricky. So what sort of things do we see happen in these sort of transactions?
Yeah, typically like when you're buying a house, your agent will put in, subject to probate approval. And that once the house is under contract, it's their job to kind of send it off to get it approved. They basically need a tax release. And depending on how backed up the probate courts are, I've seen it happen as quickly as like 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And then I've seen it take as long as 6 to 8 weeks.
We've seen some have with complicated situations or maybe where one of the heirs is contesting.
Mine was no complications.
They can be complicated and it can take a little bit of time. So for me as a lender, because I also generally find that out when I get the contract that this is subject to probate or subject to estate approval, I will usually have a conversation with my borrowers about what does this mean for you, right? It means that number one, we probably don't really know what your closing date is. Because the closing date is contingent upon something else that you as the buyer have no control over. You have no control over what's happening with the probate or the estate of that property. The second thing that I like to warn people about is just normally we would lock an interest rate early on in a transaction. We don't generally love to do that with probated property. Sometimes there are complications and sometimes we don't always know how long it will take. So to lock a rate and then potentially have it expire and have to extend can get a little bit complicated. So we usually kind of like to wait until we get some assurance, either that probate approval is coming soon or that it is complete before we're really locking any deadlines in.
And part of that also has to do with the person filing with probate. Oftentimes, if an attorney is handling it, it typically goes pretty smooth. Once in a blue moon, the heirs will try to take this on themselves because the probate process is actually very costly. But if they miss one crossing of the T or one dotting of the I, it just kind of sets them back to square one from the beginning. So
another complication that can happen as well in both estates and probate are usually when you're dealing with these transactions, there is more than one person who is selling the property and they don't always agree upon selling it, the terms of the sale price, what offers, and that can be a little bit complicated as well.
Absolutely. You were telling me you had one. I don't typically have them with like 2 people, maybe 3, but you had one with
10. I had a borrower who was purchasing a house that had 10 signers. So every contract, addendum, everything had to be signed by 10 people across the country.
Sounds
So
like a
it
nightmare.
was long, even just for me to get the contract back. We had an offer accepted and I did not get an executed contract for almost 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And thankfully everybody understood that, like, there's not a lot I can do without an executed contract. I need that. So everybody was fine in that. Like, this is going to take as long as it takes. But it was tough because one of the 10, did not agree with the sale of the property.
Mm.
So she did not want to sell the property. She wanted somebody in the family to purchase it. She was cranky. So she kind of delayed every document that got signed, which, I think it took about 4 months for us to close on that house.
Wow.
And again, everybody knew up front it was going to be long, but not quite that long.
Wow. Yeah. Another thing to kind of look out for, if the house you're purchasing has somebody signing as a power of attorney, individual, those rights end when somebody passes.
Yeah.
So the person who is signing on behalf as power of attorney on behalf of maybe a parent, those rights completely disappear the moment that person passes. And that happens. Like, we had it happen a few years ago, mid-transaction, and our buyer unfortunately got delayed by like 6 weeks or something ridiculous. Ended up having to eat the rate lock because there wasn't enough money in the estate to cover there just wasn't any money. And they ended up taking ownership of the property with furniture in the house.
Yep. And that's something that actually I have found happens a lot. And I've had borrowers ask me, and I'm like, you talk to your attorney and your realtor, but they do take ownership. A lot of times those estate properties are kind of as is. You must dispose of unwanted belongings, especially like sometimes we'll have a property here, like say in Connecticut, and the heirs live somewhere far away. They don't necessarily want to come dispose of this stuff. So you may be taking a property on exactly, a lot of times they are as is. So I would say
as is with furniture. Usually as is specific to the house, like plumbing, electrical, like the house itself. But this is literally as is with everything you see in it.
Yeah, so. Right. And you're like, oh, I didn't know that I was getting like, grandma's dishes.
Yeah, sometimes there's treasures in them. Like sometimes you can find some really amazing finds.
Some good stuff. Now, what can you do as a borrower to prevent these sort of things happening to you at some point?
So there's nothing to really prevent it, but to minimize the hiccups, you really want to hook up with a really good attorney, an attorney who's going to do like title search up front just to make sure there's no hiccups from previous probate issues, and to help just kind of guide things along smoothly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we always talk about in our transactions that a real estate attorney is very you don't want your mother's brother's sister's friend who is whatever kind of attorney. You really need someone who specializes in real estate anyway, but in these types of transactions it is 10 times more important to have somebody who is specializing in real estate, because they will understand, again, if you have a complicated title search, sometimes with these partially probated or not quite complete estate type properties, title is not very clean. There can be major title issues, liens on title. We see houses that went into an estate and then the estate didn't continue to pay the bills, and then now foreclosure proceedings have started. Then the estate is trying to sell the property out of foreclosure, and the title can be really, really messy. So having a great real estate attorney really, really helps, and somebody who will fight for you, because sometimes you are, again, potentially arguing with a few people.
Yeah. I mean, our contracts, like the ones that we use in the Greater Hartford Association, from the Greater Hartford Association of Realtors, basically say that the heirs are supposed to honor the contract, because basically that's a seller's like free act and will. But yeah, sometimes that's not always the case.
Yeah, it can get a little hairy.
Yeah.
Something to keep in mind as well, just as you're purchasing a home, I think, people get so excited about the home buying, right? They're going to buy the house and they don't always think about what comes next. And I will tell you, to prevent some of these things from happening when your house needs to be sold or go to an estate, when people purchase homes, it's really a great time to do two important things. Is number one, to come up with an estate plan. So as soon as you close on your transaction, you have made a lovely relationship, hopefully with your attorney. It's a great time to talk about wills, trusts, estates, what is going to happen to this house. It is especially important if you are a non-married partnership purchasing a home. So if you are engaged, dating, friends, whatever it may be, and you are not legally married, you should absolutely have an estate plan in place for that house, because what you think should happen is not necessarily what's going to happen.
Yeah, and even with that, just even having an exit plan, because sometimes relationships don't work out too. So just kind of putting in black and white, like what's going to happen, God forbid, if we break up or if we just decide to go separate ways. Like it's good to have it all outlined when everybody's happy and everybody loves each other and is thinking level-headed.
Yeah, exactly. What will happen? So that's number one. Number two, it's also a great time to get life insurance. So if you are closing on a property, it really is a good time to explore life insurance, to take a look and see, right, if one spouse something happens or one partner something happens and another person is left with the property, what do we do with that? How do we make it financially feasible? A lot of times people will take out at least a life insurance policy for the remainder of the mortgage for the other person so they can pay the house off.
Ari, have you heard of the insurance programs? Not life insurance, but I guess it is a type of life insurance that covers your mortgage, your mortgage payments. I heard of something a few years back and I never dug into it. So
that's something we should look into.
It could be a rumor. I don't know.
But yeah, probate and estate properties, they can be great deals. That's sometimes why people like them. They can be great deals. They're not nothing to be afraid of, nothing to not make offers on. Just know that there are some slight complications that can arise. And having a great team, a great realtor, a great attorney, a great lender who kind of are familiar with what these could be and can help you navigate your way through them is definitely integral.
Absolutely. If you're buying a house and the seller happens to pass midway, like we talked about, but there's nobody to open up a probate case to help move the sale along, you as a buyer can actually do that. A lot of people don't know that, but you can petition the courts and, contact your local probate company or courts, but like you can move it along yourself too. So don't feel hopeless in the event you get some sort of unfortunate news.
Yeah, and it does happen. But yeah, estate, probate, everything in between. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Sanam or I. We are happy to help.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon.